The rain hit the metal walls of Jin's research station like 1,000 angry fists. Lightning split the purple sky of Tau 7, and the wind howled through the rocky canyons surrounding his small outpost. Jin had seen plenty of storms on this remote, mining planet, but tonight felt different. The electrical readings on his monitors were going crazy, and the air itself seemed to buzz with dangerous energy. He was checking the weather shields for the third time when something caught his eye. Through the reinforced window, a dark shape lay crumpled near the entrance to his compound, barely visible through the sheets of rain. At first, Jin thought it might be debris blown by the storm, but then the shape moved slightly, and he realized with a shock that it was alive. Jin grabbed his emergency kit and rain gear, his heart pounding. Nothing should be out there in this weather. The nearest settlement was 300 kilometers away, and the local wildlife knew better than to venture out during electrical storms. Yet something was lying helpless in the mud outside his door. He stepped into the storm. The wind nearly knocked him over. Rain stung his face like needles, and the thunder was so loud he could feel it in his bones. He fought his way to the collapsed figure, and what he saw made him freeze for a moment. The being wasn't human. That much was clear immediately. She was tall, probably over 6 feet, with a lean but powerful build that spoke of years of physical training. Her skin had a pale, almost translucent quality, and strange markings ran along her arms and face. These markings glowed faintly with bioluminescent light, but the glow was weak and flickering like a dying battery. Her face was angular and sharp, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. Her eyes were closed, but Jin could see they were larger than human eyes. Her hair was white as snow and plastered to her head by the rain. Most striking of all were the subtle ridges along her temples and the slightly pointed ears that marked her as definitely not from Earth. Next to her lay what was obviously a weapon. It looked like some kind of energy rifle, sleek and alien in design. Everything about her appearance screamed warrior, from the way she was dressed in form-fitting tactical gear to the multiple scars visible on her exposed skin. This was someone who lived by violence, someone dangerous. But right now she was unconscious and clearly dying. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and even in the dim light, Jin could see how thin she had become. Her cheeks were hollow, and her clothes hung loose on her frame. Whatever she was, wherever she had come from, she was starving. Jin knew the protocols. First contact with alien species was supposed to go through proper channels. There were procedures, forms to fill out, authorities to contact. Getting involved with an unknown alien, especially one who carried weapons, was exactly the kind of thing that could end his career and possibly his life. But as another bolt of lightning illuminated her pale face, Jin saw something that made all the protocols seem meaningless. She looked so young, so vulnerable, lying there in the mud. Despite her obvious warrior nature, despite the weapon at her side, all he could see was someone who needed help. Without another thought, Jin scooped her up in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, which only confirmed how malnourished she was. Her head fell back against his shoulder, and he could feel how cold her skin was even through the rain. Fighting against the storm, Jin carried her inside to safety. Jin had barely finished wrapping the alien woman in warm blankets when her eyes snapped open. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, pale silver with flecks of blue that seemed to shift and swirl like storm clouds. For a split second, she looked confused and lost. Then her warrior instincts kicked in. The bioluminescent markings along her face and arms blazed to life, pulsing with angry red light. She tried to bolt upright, reaching for where her weapon should have been, but her weakened body betrayed her. She collapsed back onto the medical cot, gasping for breath, but her eyes never left Jin's face. Those silver eyes burned with suspicion and barely contained rage. Jin had moved her weapon to the far side of the room while she was unconscious. It was a smart decision because even in her weakened state, she looked ready to kill him if she could reach it. Her lips pulled back in what might have been a snarl, revealing teeth that were slightly sharper than human teeth. The red glow from her markings cast eerie shadows across the small medical bay. "Easy there," Jin said softly, raising his hands, to show he meant no harm. "You're safe, I'm not going to hurt you." She tilted her head at his words, and the angry red glow shifted to confused orange patterns that rippled across her skin like water. It was clear she didn't understand his language, but something in his tone seemed to register. Her breathing slowed slightly. Though she remained coiled like a spring ready to snap, Jin moved very slowly to a nearby shelf and picked up a water bottle and some protein bars. The alien woman's eyes tracked his every movement, and he could see her calculating distances, looking for escape routes, assessing threats. Even starving and exhausted, she was thinking like a predator. "Look," Jin said, holding up the water. "Bottle. Water. You need this." He mimicked drinking from it, then set it down on a small table and pushed it toward her before backing away several steps. Her nostrils flared, and Jin realized she was probably analyzing his scent, trying to determine if he was lying or setting a trap. Her markings continued their color dance, shifting from orange to yellow to pale blue. It was like watching emotions play out in living light across her skin. For several long minutes they stared at each other. Jin kept his movements slow and non-threatening, while she seemed to be waging some kind of internal battle. Her body clearly needed the water desperately. Her lips were cracked, and he could see the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of severe dehydration, but accepting help from a stranger went against every survival instinct she had. Finally, desperation won. She lunged for the water bottle, grabbed it, and retreated to the far corner of the cot like a wild animal protecting its food. She drank deeply, her eyes never leaving Jin's face. Water ran down her chin, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand, still watching him with naked suspicion. Jin unwrapped one of the protein bars and broke off a small piece. He ate it himself first, then offered her the rest. This seemed to confuse her even more. The bioluminescent patterns on her skin shifted to swirling purples and blues that Jin was beginning to recognize as confusion or uncertainty. "Vel," she said suddenly, her voice rough from thirst and disuse. She pointed to herself. "Vel." Jin smiled and pointed to his own chest. "Jin." She repeated his name slowly, her accent making it sound exotic and strange. Then she said something in her own language, a series of clicks and melodic sounds that Jin couldn't begin to understand. But her tone had changed. The hostility was still there, but underneath it was something else. Bewilderment, maybe even a tiny spark of curiosity about this strange human who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. Over the next few days, Jin and Vel developed a strange routine, built on gestures, simple words, and careful observation. Vel's strength was slowly returning thanks to regular meals and clean water, but she remained as wary as a caged wolf. She would accept Jin's help, but she clearly didn't understand why he was giving it. On the third morning, as Jin brought her breakfast, Vel suddenly began speaking in her own language. Her voice was urgent, and her bioluminescent markings pulsed with frustrated yellow light. She kept pointing toward the window, toward the vast wilderness beyond the research station. Jin sat down across from her, listening patiently, even though he couldn't understand a word. Something about her tone told him this was important. She was trying to explain something, and it was eating her alive that he couldn't understand. Vel suddenly stood up and walked to Jin's computer terminal. Her movements were still a bit shaky, but her natural grace was returning. She began pointing at the screen, then at herself, then back at the screen. Jin realized she wanted to show him something. "Computer," Jin said slowly, then gestured for her to try. It took several attempts, but eventually Vel managed to access the planetary database. Her fingers moved across the holographic interface with surprising skill, and Jin realized that despite their differences, her people's technology wasn't that different from human tech. What she showed him made his blood run cold. On the screen was a wanted poster, featuring a creature that looked like a nightmare come to life. It was humanoid, but wrong in every way, with twisted features and dead black eyes. The bounty amount displayed was staggering, more money than Jin would see in 10 lifetimes. Vel pointed to the monster on the screen, then to herself, then made a gesture that clearly meant tracking or hunting. She pulled up star charts and showed him a path that zigzagged across multiple solar systems. Her journey had taken her incredibly far from wherever she had started. Then her expression grew dark. She showed him images of a space battle, pointing to a sleek ship that must have been hers. In the next image, the ship was debris floating in space. She had lost everything in the fight, but somehow she had made it to an escape pod and followed her target here to Tau 7. Jin began to understand. Vel was a bounty hunter, and she had been chasing this criminal across the galaxy. She had sacrificed her ship, her equipment, everything she owned to follow her prey to this remote planet. For weeks, she had been hunting on foot through the dangerous wilderness, growing weaker and more desperate with each passing day. But what Jin couldn't understand was why she seemed so frustrated with him. Every time he brought her food or checked on her injuries, her markings would flash with confused colors. She would stare at him like he was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Finally, on the fourth day, Vel did something that caught Jin completely off guard. She reached into her gear and pulled out a small device that looked like some kind of currency reader. She tried to scan Jin's wrist, looking disappointed when nothing happened. Then she began searching through her belongings, clearly looking for something to give him. Jin realized what was happening and gently pushed her hands away. "No," he said softly. "No payment. You don't owe me anything." The confusion on Vel's face was almost painful to watch. Her markings shifted through rapid cycles of color, and she seemed genuinely distressed. She kept trying to give him things, growing more agitated each time he refused. Finally, she sat down heavily and put her head in her hands. Jin understood then that in Vel's world, everything had a price. Every favor came with a debt. Every kindness required payment. The idea that someone would help her simply because she needed help was completely foreign to her. It went against everything she had been taught about how the universe worked. But Jin kept bringing her meals. He continued to check her wounds and make sure she was comfortable. And slowly, very slowly, Vel began to accept that maybe this strange human really did expect nothing in return. By the end of the first week, something unexpected began to happen. Vel started following Jin around the research station, watching everything he did with intense curiosity. At first, Jin thought she was looking for weaknesses or planning an escape route, but gradually, he realized she was genuinely interested in his work. When Jin went outside to collect soil samples, Vel would position herself near the door, her head tilted and alert. Her superior hearing could pick up sounds that Jin completely missed. Twice she grabbed his arm and pulled him back, just as dangerous predators emerged from the rocky outcroppings around the station. The local wildlife on Tau 7 was nothing to mess with, and Jin had been living dangerously without even knowing it. "Thank you," Jin would say each time, and Vel's markings would glow with soft blue light. He was beginning to understand that blue meant something positive, maybe satisfaction or pleasure. She was starting to take pride in keeping him safe. Their communication improved day by day. Jin would point to objects and say their names in human language, while Vel would repeat the words back in her musical accent. In return, she taught him basic words in her language. Her people were called the Kithara, and their words sounded like a combination of singing and clicking that was surprisingly beautiful. But it was during the medical treatments that their real bond began to form. Vel had several infected wounds that she had been hiding under her tactical gear. The injuries were worse than Jin had initially thought, with deep gashes along her ribs and a particularly nasty cut on her left shoulder that had begun to fester. At first, Vel refused to let Jin near the wounds. She would hiss and back away. Whenever he approached with medical supplies, her markings flashing bright red with warning colors. But the infections were getting worse, and they both knew she would die if they weren't treated properly. The breakthrough came when Jin showed her his own scars. He rolled up his sleeves and showed her the marks on his arms from various accidents during his research work. Then he pointed to a longer scar across his palm and made gestures to indicate that someone else had helped him when he was hurt. Something in Vel's expression changed. Her markings shifted to deep purple, which Jin was learning meant sadness or grief. She looked at his scars, then at her own wounds, and seemed to make a decision. Slowly, she allowed him to clean and bandage her injuries. The process was painful, and Jin could see her fighting not to cry out, but she stayed still and let him work. As he carefully cleaned each wound, Jin found himself talking to her softly, telling her about his life on the research station, about the loneliness of being the only human for hundreds of kilometers. To his surprise, Vel began to respond. She couldn't understand all his words, but she seemed to understand the emotion behind them. She began to speak in her own language, her voice soft and sad. Even without understanding the words, Jin could hear the pain in her voice. Through gestures and the few words they shared, a story began to emerge. Vel had been alone for a very long time. She showed him scars that clearly came from her own people, touching them with a sadness that transcended language barriers. She had been cast out, exiled for reasons Jin couldn't fully understand. They were both outcasts in their own ways. Jin had chosen isolation to escape his grief, while Vel had had isolation forced upon her. But here in this remote research station, they had found something neither had expected to find again: companionship. When Jin finished treating her wounds, Vel did something that surprised him. She reached out and gently touched the scar on his palm, her markings glowing with soft golden light. It was the first truly gentle gesture she had made since arriving, and Jin understood it was her way of saying thank you. 2 weeks after Vel's arrival, everything changed in an instant. Jin was calibrating his geological equipment when Vel suddenly went rigid beside him. Her markings blazed bright white, and she dropped into a hunting crouch that made Jin's blood run cold. She had found her prey. Vel moved to the window and pointed toward a distant canyon. Jin grabbed his binoculars and scanned the area. At first he saw nothing but rocks and scrub vegetation. Then movement caught his eye and he spotted the creature from the wanted poster. Even at this distance, the thing looked wrong, moving in a way that seemed to hurt just to watch. Vel was already gathering her gear, checking her weapon with practiced efficiency. Her markings had shifted to deep red, the color Jin had learned, meant danger and aggression. She was transforming back into the deadly hunter he had first found outside his door. "Wait," Jin said, grabbing her arm. "You can't go alone, you're still recovering." Vel shook her head and pointed to herself, then to the canyon. Her meaning was clear. This was her hunt, her responsibility. She had been tracking this monster across the galaxy, and she would finish it alone. But Jin had seen how weak she still was. The medical treatments had helped, but weeks of starvation had taken their toll. Her hands still shook slightly when she was tired, and she moved more slowly than someone of her obvious training should. Going after a dangerous war criminal in her condition was suicide. "No," Jin said firmly. "If you're going, I'm going with you." The look Vel gave him was pure confusion. Her markings shifted to the swirling purple that meant she couldn't understand what was happening. She gestured frantically between herself and the canyon, trying to make him understand that this was dangerous, that he could be killed. Jin went to his equipment locker and pulled out his emergency gear. He wasn't a soldier, but life on a frontier planet had taught him how to handle himself. He had a basic plasma rifle and protective gear that would have to do. Vel watched him, prepare with growing alarm. Her markings cycled through colors Jin had never seen before, and she kept making gestures that clearly meant he should stay behind where it was safe. She couldn't understand why he would risk his life for her mission, but Jin was determined. Over the past weeks, he had come to care about this strange alien woman more than he wanted to admit. The thought of her going into danger alone was unbearable. They moved out across the rocky terrain together, with Vel leading the way. Her natural grace and predatory instincts made her almost invisible as she moved from cover to cover. Jin did his best to follow her example, though he knew he was clumsy. Compared to her fluid movements, the hunt took hours. The war criminal was cunning and dangerous, setting traps and false trails that would have fooled a lesser tracker. But Vel was relentless, following signs that Jin couldn't even see. Her focus was absolute, her every movement calculated for maximum efficiency. When they finally cornered their prey in a narrow canyon, the battle was swift and brutal. The criminal was everything the wanted poster had promised: fast, vicious, and completely without mercy. It moved like a nightmare, striking with claws and teeth that could tear through metal. But Vel was faster. Years of training and natural talent, combined with her desperate need to complete this hunt. She fought with a deadly beauty that took Jin's breath away, every movement precise and lethal. When the criminal finally fell, it was with Vel's weapon, pointed at its heart. As they secured their prisoner, something amazing happened. Vel kept looking at Jin with wonder in her silver eyes. Her markings glowed with soft gold light, and she reached out to check him for injuries before even thinking about the massive bounty they had just captured. Jin realized that in her world, partners always had ulterior motives. Everyone wanted their share of the profit. But Jin's first concern was her safety, not the money. This simple act of caring had shattered everything Vel thought she knew about how people treated each other. The bounty transfer went through 3 days later, and suddenly Vel had enough credits to buy a new ship and return to her old life. Jin watched her checking departure schedules on his computer, her movements quick and efficient. She was planning to leave just as he had always known she would. But something had changed in the way she moved around the station. Where before she had been constantly alert for danger, now she seemed relaxed, almost comfortable. She helped Jin with his daily routines without being asked, and her bioluminescent markings stayed in soft, peaceful colors most of the time. Jin tried to act normal, but inside he felt a growing emptiness. The research station had felt like home with Vel there. Her presence had filled a loneliness he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The thought of going back to the endless quiet, days and empty conversations with his computer, made his chest tight. Vel seemed to sense his mood. She would catch him staring out the window with a distant expression, and her markings would shift to concerned blues and purples. Sometimes she would stand beside him, not saying anything, just sharing the silence in a way that somehow made it less lonely. On what was supposed to be her last night, Vel did something unexpected. She cooked dinner using her own people's methods, creating a meal that was strange but delicious. They ate together in comfortable quiet, and Jin found himself memorizing every detail, the way she moved her hands when she talked, the soft sound of her language, the gentle glow of her markings in the dim light. After dinner, Vel went to her sleeping area and began packing her few belongings. Jin sat at his desk, pretending to work, but actually listening to every sound she made. Tomorrow she would be gone, and he would be alone again. That's when the alarms started screaming. Jin's security system had detected multiple ships approaching fast from the outer atmosphere. The radar showed at least 6 vessels, and they were coming in hot with weapons powered up. Raiders had found his isolated station, probably drawn by reports of the valuable research equipment he kept there. "Get down!" Jin shouted, pulling Vel away from the window just as the first energy blasts hit the station's shields. The whole building shook, and emergency lights bathed everything in red. Jin ran to his communication console, but the raiders were jamming all frequencies. No distress signal would get through. They were on their own against 6 ships full of armed criminals who wanted everything Jin had spent years collecting. He grabbed his rifle and started toward the defensive positions. He had prepared for exactly this kind of attack. But when he turned around, Vel was gone. His heart sank as he realized she must have slipped out during the confusion. She had taken the smart path, the survivor's path. Why would she risk her life for his problems? The raiders landed with thunderous crashes outside. Jin could hear them, setting up equipment, probably cutting through his reinforced doors. He had maybe 5 minutes before they broke through. Then he heard something that made him stop breathing. The sound of Vel's weapon firing, followed by shouts of alarm from the raiders outside. She hadn't run. She was out there, fighting for him. Jin rushed to the security monitors and saw something incredible. Vel moved through the raiders like a force of nature, using the darkness and her superior senses to strike and disappear before they could react. Her bioluminescent markings were completely dark, making her nearly invisible in the night. But there were too many of them. Even with her skills, she couldn't take on 6 ships' worth of raiders alone. Jin made his choice. He disabled the station's security locks and stepped outside into the battle. What followed was the longest 10 minutes of Jin's life. He and Vel fought side by side, covering each other's backs with an instinctive teamwork that surprised them both. Jin's knowledge of the local terrain combined with Vel's combat expertise proved devastating. The raiders had expected to overwhelm a single researcher, not face 2 determined defenders who fought like they had been partners for years. When the last raider fell, Jin and Vel stood among the wreckage, both wounded but alive. Vel's tactical. Gear was torn and blood ran down her arm from a grazer shot. Jin had a cut across his forehead, and his hands were shaking from adrenaline. They looked at each other across the battlefield, and something passed between them that needed no words. Vel's markings glowed with warm, golden light, and she smiled. It was the first real smile Jin had seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. She had found something worth more than any bounty. 6 months had transformed Jin's quiet research station into something completely different. Where once there had been only the hum of computers and the whistle of wind through the canyon, now there was life and purpose that filled every corner of the small outpost. Vel had officially registered as Jin's security consultant, but their partnership had grown into something much more complex and meaningful. She had learned to read his geological equipment almost as well as he could, her sharp eyes spotting mineral formations that his human vision missed entirely. In return, Jin had become surprisingly good at tracking, his patience and analytical mind complementing her natural hunting instincts perfectly. Their morning routine had become a comfortable dance. Jin would wake to find Vel already up, checking the perimeter sensors and weather reports while brewing the strong, bitter coffee they both preferred. She had modified the recipe with herbs from her homeworld that she grew in small pots around the station, creating a blend that was uniquely theirs. The language barrier that had once seemed impossible had gradually dissolved. Jin now spoke Kithara with reasonable fluency, though his accent still made Vel's markings flicker with amused gold whenever he attempted the more complex tonal combinations. She spoke human standard better than most humans, her naturally musical voice making even technical geological terms sound like poetry. But it was the unspoken communication that had become their greatest strength. Jin could read Vel's bioluminescent patterns like a mood ring, understanding her thoughts and feelings through the subtle color changes that played across her skin. She, in turn, had learned to interpret his human expressions and body language with an accuracy that sometimes startled him. When Jin grew frustrated with a particularly difficult rock sample, Vel would appear beside him with a cup of coffee and a patient ear. When Vel's markings dimmed with memories of her exile, Jin would find quiet ways to distract her, usually by asking for help with some task that made her feel needed and valued. Their work had evolved beyond simple research. Word had spread through certain channels that there was a human Kithara team on Tau 7 who took on special cases. They only accepted contracts for the worst criminals, the ones who preyed on the innocent and weak. Vel's reputation as a hunter, combined with Jin's analytical skills and local knowledge, made them surprisingly effective. Just last month, they had tracked down a slave trader who had been operating in the Outer Rim territories. The investigation had taken weeks of careful detective work, with Jin analyzing shipping manifests and communication logs, while Vel gathered intelligence from her contacts in the bounty hunter community. When they finally cornered the trader, it had been Jin's knowledge of local cave systems that had prevented the criminal's escape. The capture had been clean and efficient, but what happened afterward had shown how much their partnership meant to both of them. The substantial reward they received was split equally without discussion, but Vel had insisted on using her share to upgrade the station's defensive systems. Jin had used his portion to buy better communication equipment so Vel could stay in touch with the few friends she had scattered across the galaxy. In the evenings, they would sit on the station's small observation deck, watching the purple sunset paint the canyon walls in brilliant colors. Vel would tell stories of distant worlds and alien cultures, her voice weaving pictures of places Jin could barely imagine. Jin would share his scientific discoveries, explaining the geological history written in the rocks around them, making the ancient stones seem alive with their own stories. These quiet moments had become precious to both of them. Vel's markings would glow with soft, contented blues and greens as she relaxed in ways she never had during her years of solitary hunting. Jin found himself laughing more than he had in years, Vel's dry sense of humor and unique perspective on human behavior keeping him constantly entertained. They had created something neither had expected to find, a true partnership built on mutual respect shared purpose and deep affection that transcended the vast differences between their species. The ships appeared on Jin's sensors just after dawn, 3 sleek vessels dropping out of hyperspace with the kind of precision that spoke of military training. Jin's blood ran cold when he saw their design. They were Kithara warships, and they were heading straight for the research station. Vel was outside checking the mineral extractors when the alarm sounded. She looked up at the approaching ships, and Jin watched through the window as her entire posture changed. Her relaxed, comfortable stance disappeared, replaced by the rigid alertness of a warrior preparing for battle. Her markings blazed bright red, then quickly dimmed to almost nothing. She was making herself as invisible as possible. "Vel," Jin called through the comm system. "Get inside. Now." She moved quickly but smoothly, her predatory grace returning as if she had never lost it. Once inside, she went straight to the weapons locker and began arming herself with practiced efficiency. Her face had gone completely blank, showing no emotion at all. "Who are they?" Jin asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "My people," Vel said simply, her voice carrying no inflection. "They have come for me." The lead ship landed with deliberate ceremony just outside the station's main entrance. Jin watched through the security cameras as the boarding ramp lowered, and 5 figures emerged. They moved with the same deadly grace as Vel, but there was something different about them. Where Vel's movements had become fluid and natural over the months they had lived together, these Kithara moved with rigid, almost mechanical precision. The leader was clearly the most dangerous of the group. He was taller than Vel, with broader shoulders and more pronounced ridges along his temples. His bioluminescent markings pulsed with cold blue light, and even through the camera, Jin could see the contempt in his silver eyes. "Velnash," the leader called out, his voice carrying easily through the thin air. He was using Vel's full name. Jin realized something she had never told him. "You will come out. You will face judgment." Vel's markings flashed once with angry red, then went completely dark. "Kazik," she whispered, and Jin heard years of pain and betrayal in that single word. Jin moved to stand beside her. "You don't have to go out there." Vel looked at him with something that might have been gratitude, but her expression was already hardening into the mask she had worn when he first found her. "Yes, I do. This is Kithara law. I cannot run from it forever." She walked to the door, then paused. "Jin," she said without turning around. "Whatever happens, know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life." The door sealed behind her with a soft hiss, and Jin was left alone with the security monitors and his growing fear. Outside, the 5 Kithara formed a semicircle. Around Vel, Kazik stepped forward, his markings pulsing with authority and disdain. When he spoke, his voice carried across the canyon like a weapon. "Velnash of the Severed Bonds," he announced formally. "You have been found guilty of contamination by alien weakness. You have forgotten the strength of our people. You have become soft." Vel stood perfectly still, but Jin could see the tension in her shoulders. "I have become myself, Kazik, something you never allowed." Kazik's markings flared with anger. "You were cast out for showing mercy to enemies. Now you live with humans, the weakest species in the galaxy. You have proven that our judgment was correct." That's when Vel did something that surprised everyone. She laughed. It was a sound Jin had heard many times over the past months, but it seemed to shock the other Kithara. Her markings began to glow with confident gold light. "Weak?" she said, her voice carrying a strength Jin had never heard before. "You think humans are weak because they show kindness. You think I am weak because I have learned to care." She stepped forward, and the other Kithara instinctively moved back. Even Jin could see the power radiating from her now, the deadly confidence of a warrior who had found her true strength. "I challenge you, Kazik," Vel declared, her voice ringing across the canyon. "Trial by combat, as is my right. When I defeat you, you will listen to what I have learned about real strength." The combat circle formed in the flat area outside Jin's research station was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. The other Kithara moved with ritual precision, marking boundaries in the sand with their weapons while chanting in low, musical tones that seemed to make the very air vibrate with ancient power. Vel and Kazik faced each other in the center of the circle, and the difference between them was striking. Kazik moved with the cold efficiency of traditional Kithara training, his every gesture calculated and controlled. Vel moved with something else entirely, a fluid grace that seemed to blend her natural abilities with something new, something human. The fight was swift and decisive. Kazik attacked with textbook precision, exactly as Jin had seen Vel fight when she first arrived. But Vel had changed. She fought with creativity, adaptability, and something that Kazik clearly didn't expect. She protected herself not just to win, but because she had something worth living for. When Kazik fell, defeated but alive, the silence stretched across the canyon like a held breath. Vel stood over him, not with the cold triumph of a traditional Kithara warrior, but with something that looked almost like sadness. "This is what I learned from humans," she said, her voice carrying to every member of the delegation. "Strength isn't just about being the best fighter. Real strength is caring about others, protecting them, building something together that's bigger than yourself." She gestured toward the research station, where Jin watched through the window. "That human found me dying and saved my life, asking nothing in return. He fought beside me when he could have stayed safe. He showed me that kindness isn't weakness, it's the strongest thing in the universe." One of the younger Kithara stepped forward, his markings flickering with curious purple light. "But what about honor? What about the strength of solitude?" Vel's expression softened. "I have more honor now than I ever did alone. And I'm stronger, because I have someone who believes in me, someone I want to protect." Over the following days, something unprecedented happened. Instead of forcing Vel to return with them, 3 of the younger Kithara asked permission to stay and learn. They were fascinated by the partnership between Vel and Jin, by the way they worked together with such obvious trust and affection. Jin found himself hosting an impromptu cultural exchange program. His quiet research station became a bustling center of activity, as the young Kithara observed everything with intense curiosity. They watched Jin and Vel work together on geological surveys, noting how they communicated with glances and gestures that spoke of deep understanding. One of them, a warrior named Thex, was particularly interested in Jin's scientific methods. "How you seek truth in rocks," he observed, his markings glowing with fascination. "Among my people we seek truth only in combat." Jin smiled, wiping mineral dust from his hands. "Maybe truth is bigger than either of our methods alone. Maybe we find more of it when we work together." The transformation of the station continued over the weeks that followed. More Kithara arrived, some skeptical, others genuinely curious about what they had heard. Jin installed additional living quarters and expanded the communication systems to handle interstellar traffic. Vel became the bridge between the two cultures, translating not just languages, but entire ways of thinking. She helped the young Kithara understand human concepts of cooperation and mutual support, while helping Jin appreciate the fierce independence and honor that drove her people. The breakthrough came when they worked together to track down a particularly dangerous criminal who had been terrorizing shipping lanes. The combined team of humans and Kithara proved incredibly effective, with each species contributing their unique strengths to the mission. As word spread through both human and Kithara space networks, Jin's station began receiving official recognition. Diplomatic envoys arrived to study what was happening there. Scientists came to document the unprecedented cooperation between species that had barely known each other existed. But for Jin and Vel, the most important changes were personal. In the evenings, they would sit on their observation deck as they always had, but now they were often joined by others. The conversations ranged across cultures and species, but always came back to the same fundamental truth that had brought them together. Kindness was not weakness. Understanding was not surrender, and sometimes the smallest acts of compassion could change the entire galaxy. Looking out over the bustling station that had once been his lonely outpost, Jin marveled at how far they had come from that stormy night when he had found a dying alien outside his door and decided to help her simply because it was the right thing to do.